You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, bearing the papal seal and an offer that would change my life forever. My name is Father Marcus Benedetti, and at 34, I'd spent the better part of my adult life translating dead languages in the dusty archives of minor seminaries across Europe. The Vatican's invitation to serve as Senior Archivist of the restricted collection felt like divine providence answering years of scholarly prayer. I should have recognized it as a summons to damnation. 3 weeks later, I stood in the marble corridors of the Vatican, my footsteps echoing off stone that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Cardinal Alessandro Rossi awaited me at the entrance to the administrative wing, a man whose grey eyes seemed to hold the weight of accumulated knowledge and regret. His handshake was firm, but cold, and when he smiled, it never quite reached those ancient eyes. "Father Benedetti," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of old Roman nobility, "your reputation precedes you. Your work on the Coptic manuscripts in Ravenna was particularly impressive. We have need of such dedication here." He led me through corridors lined with priceless artwork, past Swiss guards who nodded respectfully but watched me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. Was it pity? Warning? The paintings on the walls seemed to follow our progress, their subjects' eyes tracking our movement in ways that made my skin crawl. "Tell me, Father," Cardinal Rossi said as we walked, "what do you know of forbidden knowledge?" The question caught me off guard. I understand that throughout history, the Church has encountered texts and artifacts that were deemed spiritually dangerous, materials that could lead the faithful astray or corrupt the soul. A diplomatic answer. His smile was thin, but incomplete. What if I told you that some knowledge is forbidden, not because it leads souls astray, but because it has the power to unmake reality itself? What if certain truths, once spoken, could tear holes in the fabric of existence? I laughed nervously. I would say that sounds more like medieval superstition than modern theology. Cardinal Rossi stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "By tomorrow evening, Father Benedetti, you will never use the word superstition again." We began our descent into the depths of the Vatican. The first staircase was grand, carved marble with ornate railings. The second was simpler stone. The third was ancient, rough-hewn blocks that predated the current structure by centuries. With each level, the air grew colder and heavier, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. The Bibliotheca Prohibita was established in 1559, Cardinal Rossi explained as we descended. Pope Paul IV ordered the collection of texts that posed a threat to the faithful, but it quickly became apparent that we were dealing with something far more dangerous than heretical theology. Some books, Father Benedetti, are alive. They think, they hunger, they remember. The fourth staircase was carved directly into living rock, its walls bearing symbols that hurt to look at directly. I found myself avoiding eye contact with the carvings, though I couldn't explain why. The electric lighting became sparse here, supplemented by torches that cast dancing shadows across stone that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. In 1623, Cardinal Rossi continued, we lost our first archivist. Father Eduardo was found 3 days after he failed to return from his duties. His body was discovered in his private chambers, but something was wrong. He had aged 50 years in a single night. His hair had turned white, his skin was wrinkled and spotted with age, and his eyes. Cardinal Rossi paused. His eyes contained knowledge that no mortal man should possess. He spoke in languages that predated human civilization before his heart gave out from the strain. We reached the fifth and final staircase. The walls here were not carved stone, but something else entirely, a material that looked almost organic, as if we were descending into the throat of some massive creature. The air itself seemed to resist our passage, thick and oppressive. That was when the first rules were written, Cardinal Rossi said. Each subsequent tragedy taught us something new about the forces we were dealing with. The current list of 5 rules represents 4 centuries of hard-learned wisdom, paid for with the souls of good men. At the bottom of the stairs stood a gate unlike anything I had ever seen. It was clearly ancient, predating the Vatican by millennia. The metal was black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the bars were inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed peripherally. Beyond the gate lay the forbidden library itself. The chamber was vast, far larger than should have been possible given the Vatican's layout above. Shelves stretched up into darkness beyond the reach of any lighting, filled with books, scrolls, tablets and bound volumes, in materials I couldn't identify. The smell of old parchment mixed with something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. "This will be your domain," Cardinal Rossi said, producing an ornate brass key that felt warm to the touch when he placed it in my palm. "You will catalogue and preserve these texts, maintaining the barriers that keep their contents contained. But understand this clearly. You are not merely a librarian. You are a sentinel standing guard between 2 worlds." He handed me a leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. The pages inside were filled with handwriting in various scripts, Latin phrases and detailed diagrams that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. These are the 5 rules that have protected every archivist who survived this position. They were written in blood, both literally and figuratively. Every word was learned through tragedy, through the loss of good men whose souls now reside somewhere beyond our reach. I opened the notebook to the first page and began reading the rules, written in elegant Latin script. Rule 1, never work alone between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. Cardinal Rossi's voice took on the cadence of a funeral oration. "The boundary between day and night is more than astronomical, Father. It represents a thinning of the veil between worlds. During darkness, the entities bound within these texts become active, seeking any opportunity to influence our reality. Previous archivists reported hearing whispers in languages that predate human speech, seeing shadows move independently of their sources, and finding books rearranged into patterns that spelled out messages from beyond." He gestured towards a section of the library where the shelves seemed darker than the rest. Father Wilhelm ignored this rule in 1954. We found him the next morning, or rather, we found his body. His mind had been elsewhere. He spent his remaining days in the Vatican's private sanatorium, speaking to people who weren't there and writing frantically in a notebook. When he died 6 months later, we examined his writings. They contained detailed conversations with every archivist who had died in this position since 1623. They were discussing how to lure the next victim into joining them. Rule 2, always carry blessed salt in your left pocket. The salt must be blessed specifically by the Pope's personal chaplain using a ritual that dates back 12 centuries. The blessing incorporates elements that most priests never learn, words in Enochian that bind protective forces to the salt itself. It will grow warm when supernatural activity is present, providing you with early warning. When it burns, you are in immediate, mortal danger. Cardinal Rossi reached into his robes and produced a small silk pouch. "Here is your first supply. Brother Francis in the private chapel will provide replacements each Wednesday. Never let your supply run low, and never use regular, blessed salt. Father Antonio made that mistake in 1978. The ordinary salt did nothing when the entities emerged from the texts. We found his remains scattered throughout the library, but the pattern they formed was not random. His bones had been arranged to spell out words in an alphabet that our linguists refuse to study. Rule 3. If you hear children laughing, immediately exit the library. Cardinal Rossi's expression grew haunted. During the Black Death of 1348, 7 children sought sanctuary in the original library that stood on this site. They were the offspring of church officials, innocent souls fleeing the plague that ravaged Rome. They hid among the forbidden texts for weeks before succumbing to the disease. Their bodies were discovered only after the plague passed, by which time something had gone wrong with their deaths. He pointed to a section where the shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. Children's spirits should pass on to eternal rest. But these 7 became trapped by prolonged exposure to the knowledge contained here. The forbidden texts corrupted their souls even in death, transforming innocent children into something hungry and malevolent. When you hear their laughter, they are testing the boundaries of their spiritual prison. If you investigate, if you show them attention or acknowledgement, you give them power over you. Father Roberto learned this in 1889. We found him in the children's section 3 days later, surrounded by 7 small skeletons. He had been played with. Rule 4. Never eat or drink anything inside the library. The act of consumption creates a spiritual vulnerability that the entities within these texts can exploit. When you nourish your physical body, you open channels between your soul and the material world. In this place where the material world intersects with realms of forbidden knowledge, those channels become pathways for possession, corruption, or worse. Cardinal Rossi's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Father Giuseppe discovered this in 1923. He was working late and ate an apple from his lunch. The transformation was gradual at first. Over the following weeks, he began speaking in languages he had never learned, demonstrating knowledge of events that hadn't yet occurred and aging at an accelerated rate. By the end of the month, he had become something that was no longer entirely human. We found him one morning, having consumed several of the most dangerous texts in the collection. He had eaten the pages, and through that consumption, the knowledge had become part of his flesh. We had to retire him from service permanently. Rule 5. If you smell roses without explanation, count to 50 while reciting the Ave Maria, then leave immediately. This is perhaps the most dangerous sign you may encounter. The scent of roses appears when the veil between dimensions grows thin enough for entities from beyond to attempt manifestation in our world. The fragrance is beautiful, intoxicating, designed to draw victims towards its source. Those who follow the scent report experiencing visions of infinite knowledge, cosmic secrets, and divine revelations. These visions are lies. Cardinal Rossi's hands trembled slightly as he continued. The entities that announce themselves with roses feed on human consciousness, devouring memories, thoughts, and eventually the soul itself. Father Matthias followed the scent in 1798. We found him standing in the deepest section of the library, perfectly preserved, but completely empty. His body continued to function for 17 days, breathing, blinking, even walking when guided. But there was nothing behind his eyes. Whatever had been Father Matthias was gone, consumed by something that wore his face like a mask. Cardinal Rossi closed the notebook and placed both hands on my shoulders. These rules aren't traditions or superstitions, Father Benedetti. They are survival protocols written in the blood of 46 men who came before you. Follow them exactly, and you may live to serve God another day. Ignore even one, and you will discover firsthand why this position has such a high turnover rate. With that chilling introduction, he unlocked the gate and led me into what would become my workplace and, ultimately, my tomb. The first month passed more peacefully than I had expected, though peaceful is a relative term when describing work in a library filled with texts that whisper when no one is listening. I established a routine that would have seemed mundane in any other context. Arrive at 7 a.m. sharp, unlock the gate with my brass key, light the oil lamps that supplemented the electric lighting, and begin the careful work of cataloguing humanity's most dangerous knowledge. The collection was staggering in its scope and horror. I worked with Gnostic Gospels that contained creation myths, so alien they made my head ache just reading them. There were detailed accounts of exorcisms where the possessed individuals had demonstrated impossible knowledge about events that occurred before their births. Confessions of people who claimed to have made bargains with entities that existed outside normal space and time filled entire volumes, their testimonies corroborated by multiple witnesses and church investigators. One particularly disturbing collection contained the personal research notes of a 16th century alchemist named Cornelius Agrippa. His experiments went far beyond the typical pursuit of transmuting base metals into gold. Agrippa claimed to have discovered methods for transmuting human souls, transforming the essence of one person into something fundamentally different. His notes detailed successful experiments performed on willing subjects, volunteers, who had sought spiritual transformation and instead found something infinitely worse. The scientific texts were perhaps most unsettling of all. These weren't simple books banned for contradicting church doctrine. They contained discoveries that the church had deemed too dangerous for human knowledge. Mathematical proofs that reality was far more fragile than anyone suspected. Astronomical observations that revealed celestial bodies that shouldn't exist. Chemical formulas that could alter the fundamental properties of matter in ways that violated every natural law. During those first weeks, I encountered subtle signs that my workplace was anything but normal. Books would be found in slightly different positions each morning, despite the library being locked and secured. The temperature would fluctuate dramatically, without apparent cause, dropping suddenly enough that my breath would become visible before returning to normal minutes later. Most unsettling were the sounds. During the deepest concentration on my work, I would hear whispers in languages I didn't recognize. The voices seemed to come from the books themselves, as if the words written on their pages were being spoken aloud by invisible readers. When I would look up to investigate, the whispers would stop, leaving only the oppressive silence of the underground chamber. The blessed salt in my left pocket served as my constant companion and early warning system. Brother Francis had explained the blessing ritual in general terms, though he admitted that much of the ceremony was beyond his understanding. The Pope's personal chaplain performed the blessing in a private chamber deep within the Vatican, using words and gestures that dated back to the Church's earliest encounters with supernatural forces. The salt becomes a conduit for divine protection, Brother Francis had explained. But it's not passive protection. The salt actively responds to spiritual corruption, growing warm in the presence of entities that should not exist in our world. When it burns, you're being directly targeted by something that wants to do you harm. During my second week, I experienced my first significant supernatural encounter. While cataloguing a collection of medieval manuscripts about demon hierarchies, the blessed salt in my pocket began to grow noticeably warm. The sensation started as a mild heat, like carrying a warm stone, but gradually intensified until it felt like a small ember pressed against my leg. I immediately stopped my work and looked around the library. Nothing appeared different, but the atmosphere had changed in a way I couldn't quite define. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, and the shadows between the shelves seemed darker and more substantial. The whispers I had grown accustomed to became more distinct, though still incomprehensible. Following Cardinal Rossi's instructions, I carefully packed away my materials and left the library. locking the gate behind me. As I climbed the stone stairs, the salt gradually cooled, returning to normal temperature by the time I reached the main level. When I returned the next morning, I found that several books had fallen from their shelves overnight, all of them texts related to summoning rituals and demonic manifestation. Brother Antonio, the elderly groundskeeper who had worked at the Vatican for over 4 decades, became my primary source of information about the library's history. He had been present during many of the incidents that led to the creation of the current rules, and his stories filled in details that Cardinal Rossi had omitted. The worst part, Brother Antonio told me over coffee in the main building, is how normal it all seems at first. Each archivist starts with the same confidence, the same certainty that they're different from their predecessors. They follow the rules carefully for weeks or months, and then they begin to rationalize small violations. He described Father Thomas, who had lasted 6 weeks in 1978 before disappearing, after claiming he could communicate with the spirits found within the texts. He started leaving notes for the entities, little messages written on scraps of paper and left between the pages of the most dangerous books. He claimed they were writing back to him, providing translations of texts that had been incomprehensible for centuries. Father Vincent had vanished in 1991 under circumstances that still troubled Brother Antonio 27 years later. He was found on a Friday evening by one of the Swiss guards, sitting at his desk and writing furiously in a notebook. But Vincent was clearly not aware of his surroundings. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he was writing in a language none of our scholars could identify. When the guard tried to get his attention, Vincent just kept writing, filling page after page with symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them directly. The guard had left to get help, but when he returned with Cardinal Rossi and a medical team, they found only Vincent's clothes neatly folded on the desk. The notebook was still there, but every page was blank. The coffee cup Vincent had been drinking from was still warm. What bothered me most, Brother Antonio said, was that we found Vincent's handwriting throughout the library over the following days. Notes written in the margins of books, corrections to translations that had stood for centuries, commentary on texts he had never worked with. It was as if his consciousness had somehow merged with the collection itself. By my 6th week, these stories had become less cautionary tales and more like fascinating historical anecdotes. I had successfully navigated every supernatural encounter, followed the rules precisely, and felt genuinely confident in my ability to handle whatever the library presented. This confidence would prove to be my fatal flaw. The supernatural activity during this period had become almost routine. The children's laughter appeared twice more, each time prompting my immediate departure from the library. The first occurrence happened while I was examining a collection of Inquisition records. Sweet, innocent laughter echoed from the deepest sections of the library, where the most dangerous texts were kept under additional security measures. The voices called to me in Latin, their childish pronunciation making the ancient words almost endearing. Veni ad nos, Pater Marcus, habemus ludos mirabiles. Come to us, Father Marcus. We have wonderful games. Following Rule 3, I immediately locked my materials and headed for the exit. As I climbed the stairs, the laughter grew more insistent, and I heard additional voices joining the chorus. By the time I reached the 3rd level, it sounded like dozens of children were calling my name, their voices echoing up from the depths like a supernatural choir. The second encounter was more disturbing. The laughter began while I was working with a text that documented the Black Death's impact on religious communities. As the voices called to me, I realized they were speaking about events that had occurred recently in the Vatican, conversations they couldn't possibly have overheard from their spiritual prison in the library. Father Marcus, they sang in unison, we know about your meeting with Cardinal Rossi yesterday. We know about the new rules he's considering. We know about the archive in the basement that you haven't seen yet. Come play with us and we'll tell you secrets that will make you the most important scholar in the church. The temptation to investigate was almost overwhelming. What new rules was Cardinal Rossi considering? What archive was hidden below even this level? But I maintained my discipline and immediately left the library, though the children's promises of secret knowledge haunted my thoughts for hours afterward. The scent of roses appeared 3 times during my 6th week, each encounter more intense than the last. The first time caught me completely off guard while I was cataloguing a series of documents about miraculous healings that had been suppressed by the church. The fragrance began as a subtle background note, so faint I initially thought it might be coming from cleaning supplies used elsewhere in the Vatican. Gradually the scent intensified until it filled the entire library with its heavenly perfume. The smell was so beautiful, so pure and intoxicating, that I found myself standing without conscious decision. Every instinct told me to follow the fragrance to its source, to discover what wonderful thing could produce such a divine aroma. The roses seemed to whisper without words, promising revelations that would revolutionize my understanding of theology, history, and the nature of reality itself. I could see glimpses of the knowledge they offered, ancient truths about the creation of the universe, secrets about the true nature of divine power, hidden connections between every mystery I had ever encountered. Remembering Rule 5 just in time, I forced myself to sit back down and began counting while reciting the Ave Maria. Ave Maria, gratia plena. 1. Dominus tecum. 2. Benedicta tu in mulieribus. 3. By the count of 10, the whispers became audible, spoken in a woman's voice of impossible beauty. She spoke in perfect Latin about forbidden knowledge that could be mine, about becoming more than merely human, about joining the eternal scholars who had transcended the limitations of mortal existence. You could know everything, Marcus, the voice promised. Every secret, every mystery, every truth that has been hidden from humanity. All you have to do is follow the scent of roses to its source. Just a few steps into the deep archives and infinite wisdom will be yours. The temptation was so intense it was almost physical, a pulling sensation in my chest that made each heartbeat feel like a step towards the source of the roses. But I continued counting and praying, my voice growing stronger as I progressed through the numbers. At count 30, books began falling from shelves throughout the library, their pages fluttering open as they struck the floor. The woman's voice was joined by others, men, women, children, all speaking in different languages about the wonders that awaited anyone brave enough to follow the roses. 47 et benedictus fructus ventris tui. 48 Sancta Maria Mater Dei. 49 Ora pro nobis peccatoribus. 50. I immediately gathered my materials and headed for the exit, not looking back despite an overwhelming urge to turn around and see what was producing that heavenly fragrance. The scent followed me up the stone stairs, growing stronger rather than weaker as I climbed. It was only when I reached the main level that the roses finally faded, replaced by the normal smells of the Vatican's ancient stones and cleaning supplies. When I returned the next day, I found rose petals scattered throughout the library, though they crumbled to dust the moment I touched them. More disturbing were the notes written in my own handwriting, found tucked between the pages of various books. They contained detailed descriptions of the knowledge I would gain by following the roses, written in language far more sophisticated than my normal scholarly prose. I had no memory of writing these notes, and the handwriting, while clearly mine, showed subtle differences that I couldn't quite identify. The ink appeared fresh, as if the notes had been written moments before I discovered them. By my 7th week, I had grown dangerously comfortable with the supernatural activity. The encounters that had initially terrified me now seemed manageable, almost routine. I had successfully followed all protocols for nearly 2 months and felt genuinely confident in my ability to handle whatever the library presented. This confidence led me to begin rationalizing certain aspects of the rules. When the blessed salt grew warm, I sometimes continued working for a few extra minutes, telling myself that mild warmth didn't indicate immediate danger. When I occasionally heard whispers in the distance, I convinced myself they were just echoes from the parts of the Vatican complex, or air moving through ancient ventilation systems. The supernatural entities seemed to sense my growing complacency, and began testing me more subtly. The children's laughter became softer, more distant, making me question whether I had actually heard it or simply imagined it. The scent of roses appeared more briefly, sometimes so faint I wondered if it was merely my expectations creating phantom aromas. Most insidiously, I began to notice gaps in my memory. I would arrive at work in the morning to find books open to pages I didn't remember examining, notes written in my handwriting that I couldn't recall making, and progress on cataloguing projects that I had no memory of completing. Initially, I attributed these lapses to fatigue and the intense concentration required by my work. The underground environment and artificial lighting could easily disrupt normal sleep patterns, and the nature of the texts I was examining was mentally exhausting. But the memory gaps became more frequent and more substantial, sometimes encompassing entire hours of work. On a Wednesday morning during my 8th week, I discovered something that should have served as a final warning. Hidden beneath a stack of manuscript pages on my desk was a letter written in my own handwriting, addressed to myself. "Marcus, you need to be more careful. Last night you worked past 9 p.m. without realizing it. You were found by Cardinal Rossi at nearly midnight sitting at your desk and transcribing a text in a language you don't know. You have no memory of this, but I'm writing this note while you're still somewhat lucid. The entities in the library are beginning to influence you during the day, creating gaps in your consciousness that they can fill with their own purposes. You need to follow the rules more strictly, not less. Trust nothing, not even your own memories, especially not your own memories." The note was signed with my full name and dated the previous evening, but I had absolutely no recollection of writing it. More disturbing, the handwriting showed the same subtle differences I had noticed in the notes found among the rose petals. I should have reported this incident to Cardinal Rossi immediately. I should have requested a leave of absence to clear my head and regain my mental equilibrium. Instead, I convinced myself that the stress of the position was simply manifesting in unusual ways, and that maintaining my routine would help stabilize my psychological state. This rationalization would prove to be my final mistake. On a Thursday afternoon during my 9th week, I was deeply absorbed in cataloguing what appeared to be the most significant discovery of my tenure. A complete collection of documents related to a 14th century case of alleged demonic possession that had been entirely suppressed by the Church. The case involves Sister Catherine of Siena, a young nun who initially claimed to receive visions from saints but was later determined to be influenced by malevolent entities from beyond the veil of reality. The documents painted a picture of supernatural horror that surpassed even my most disturbing previous encounters. Sister Catherine's own writings, preserved in her original hand, described otherworldly experiences in vivid detail. She wrote of conversations with beings of light who gradually revealed darker intentions, miraculous healings that came at the cost of other people's suffering, and prophetic visions designed to sow discord and corruption within her religious community. The Church's investigation had been led by Cardinal Alessandro Borgia, a man whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his ruthlessness in dealing with supernatural threats. His investigators had documented everything with scientific precision, witness testimonies describing Sister Catherine speaking in languages she had never learned, demonstrations of knowledge about events occurring hundreds of miles away, and displays of physical strength that should have been impossible for someone of her diminutive stature. Most disturbing were Sister Catherine's final writings, produced during the weeks leading up to her mysterious disappearance. The handwriting deteriorated progressively, evolving from her normally elegant script into increasingly frantic scrawling. The content shifted from religious devotion to blasphemous statements written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that caused physical discomfort when examined directly. The final document in the collection was a letter from Cardinal Borgia to Pope Clement VI, describing the outcome of the investigation. Sister Catherine had vanished from her locked cell during the night, leaving behind only her religious habit and a message carved into the stone wall with what appeared to be her own fingernails. The message, reproduced in Cardinal Borgia's precise handwriting, read, "The knowledge calls, and I must answer. What I have learned cannot be unlearned. What I have become cannot be unchanged. Tell future generations that some doors, once opened, can never be closed." As I worked, transcribing and cataloguing these incredible documents, I became completely absorbed in the task. The parallels between Sister Catherine's experience and my own situation were impossible to ignore, yet I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery rather than repelled by its obvious warnings. Hours passed without my notice as I carefully preserved testimonies from church investigators, witness accounts from other nuns, and Sister Catherine's increasingly disturbing personal writings. The documents seemed to tell a story that was both historical record and prophecy, a cautionary tale that was simultaneously about events centuries past and something yet to come. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I realized I'd been working for nearly 9 hours straight without taking a proper break. My throat was parched from the library's dry atmosphere, and I'd been unconsciously licking my lips for what felt like hours. The fascinating nature of Sister Catherine's case had made me forget about basic physical needs. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the small bottle of spring water I had brought from my quarters that morning, but had completely forgotten about in my absorption with the documents. The plastic bottle was still cool to the touch, and I could hear the water sloshing inside as I pulled it out and placed it on the desk beside my work. Rule 4 clearly stated that consumption of anything inside the library was forbidden, but as I stared at the water bottle, I began to rationalize the restriction. I had followed all the rules perfectly for over 2 months. I was merely thirsty, not planning to have a full meal or extended dining session. It was just a small sip of water to wet my parched throat. The blessed salt in my pocket was completely cool, indicating no immediate supernatural presence. The library was quiet and peaceful, filled only with the gentle sounds of my scholarly work. Surely the rule was designed to prevent extended consumption that would create prolonged vulnerability to supernatural influence. A quick drink to relieve my thirst couldn't possibly trigger the same catastrophic response that Cardinal Rossi had described. I unscrewed the cap and lifted the bottle toward my lips, intending to take just enough water to wet my mouth and throat. The moment the first drop touched my tongue, reality shattered around me. Every light in the library began flickering in a synchronized pattern that hurt to look at directly. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the metal fixtures, and my breath became visible in billowing clouds. The blessed salt in my pocket erupted into searing heat, burning through the fabric of my robes and blistering the skin on my leg. The children's laughter returned, but now it was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling in impossible harmonics. What had once sounded like innocent childhood joy transformed into something predatory and ancient, filled with malevolent anticipation that made my blood run cold. Books throughout the library began falling from their shelves in cascading waves, their pages fluttering open and releasing sounds that violated every natural law. I heard screams of agony from victims of historical atrocities, prayers in languages that predated human civilization, and incantations that made my teeth ache and my vision blur with each syllable. The air filled with whispers in dozens of languages, creating a cacophony of supernatural voices, all speaking at once. They told me secrets about the true nature of reality, about the illusions that humanity had constructed to hide from cosmic truths too terrible to comprehend. They offered knowledge that would make me a god among mortals, wisdom that would allow me to reshape reality according to my will. The scent of roses appeared, but now it was overwhelming and nauseating, mixed with the stench of decay and sulfur that seemed to burn the inside of my nostrils. The beautiful fragrance that had once seemed so alluring now made me physically sick, and I could taste corruption and death in the back of my throat. I dropped the water bottle and ran towards the exit, but the heavy iron gate slammed shut with tremendous force that shook the entire library and sent shockwaves through the stone floor. The ornate brass key in my pocket had become molten hot, searing my hand when I tried to grab it. When I finally managed to pull it out despite the pain, I saw that the gate's lock had transformed into something impossible. Instead of the familiar mechanism I had used daily for 2 months, there was now a complex array of symbols that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The symbols writhed and twisted when I looked at them directly, forming patterns that my mind refused to accept as real. Dark shapes began moving throughout the library, not in my peripheral vision, but directly in front of me. Shadowy figures emerged from between the bookshelves, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid darkness given semi-solid form. As they moved closer, I could see that they wore the faces of every archivist who had died in this position, but their expressions were wrong, twisted into masks of eternal hunger and inhuman intelligence. The whispers grew more insistent, speaking directly into my ears despite coming from empty air. They told me that I had always been destined for this moment, that every choice I had made throughout my life had led inevitably to this violation of the sacred rules. They promised that my consciousness would be preserved, that I would become part of something far greater than mere humanity. "You sought knowledge, Marcus," they said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that human throats could never produce. "Now you shall have knowledge beyond measure. You shall know the thoughts of every soul that has ever lived, understand the mechanisms that drive the universe, comprehend truths that would shatter the minds of lesser beings." The leather-bound notebook containing the 5 rules materialized in the air before me, floating at eye level and opening to Rule 4. The text began glowing with light that didn't illuminate anything around it, and below the original Latin, new words appeared in what looked like fresh blood. Father Marcus Benedetti violated Rule 4 on Thursday afternoon, 4:27 p.m. during his 9th week of service. Consumed approximately 15 milliliters of spring water while cataloguing the Sister Catherine collection. Spiritual defenses compromised. Soul harvesting initiated. I tried to pray, but my voice was stolen by the supernatural forces now fully unleashed in the library. I attempted to recite the Ave Maria that had protected me during previous encounters, but the words came out as sounds that belonged to no human language, syllables that caused visible pain to the shadowy figures surrounding me. The children appeared then, not as voices but as visible forms emerging from the deepest sections of the library. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their medieval clothing tattered and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Their faces were pale and drawn, but their eyes burned with intelligence that no child should possess. "You broke the rules, Father Marcus," they sang in perfect unison, their voices creating harmonies that resonated through my bones. "Now you can play with us forever and ever and ever. We have such wonderful games to teach you, games that last for centuries." The shadowy figures of previous archivists began reaching toward me, with hands that felt ice cold despite being incorporeal. Where they touched me, my flesh grew numb, and I could feel my life force being slowly drained away. But worse than the physical sensation was the mental contact that came with their touch. Through their hands, I experienced the final moments of every archivist who had died in this library. I felt Father Giuseppe's terror as the forbidden knowledge began consuming his humanity from within. I shared Father Thomas's growing madness as he realized the spirits he thought he was communicating with were actually devouring his sanity, piece by piece. I witnessed Father Vincent's final conscious moment as his awareness was scattered across thousands of books, his consciousness trapped forever between pages of forbidden knowledge. The water bottle I had dropped began to transform, its plastic exterior melting away to reveal something underneath that should not have existed. It became a chalice made of what appeared to be human bone, yellowed with age and carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. The water inside had turned black, and when I looked into its dark surface, I saw faces staring back at me. Every archivist who had ever violated the rules was there, their faces floating in the liquid like reflections on a dark pond. They mouthed words I couldn't hear, their expressions frozen in eternal screams of anguish and regret. As I watched in horror, my own face began to appear among them, taking its place in the gallery of the damned. The children's laughter reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the library. Books continued falling from the shelves, but now they were opening themselves, their pages turning without any physical force. Text began flowing off the pages like living things, words and symbols crawling through the air and writing themselves across the walls, in scripts that predated human civilization. "Welcome to eternity, Marcus," the children sang. "Welcome to the space between knowledge and madness, where all secrets are revealed and all mysteries become torment. You wanted to preserve forbidden knowledge, and now forbidden knowledge will preserve you." The shadowy archivists pressed closer, and through their touch I began to understand the true nature of my fate. I wouldn't simply die and have my soul trapped in the library. Something far worse awaited me. My consciousness would be dispersed throughout the collection, scattered across thousands of texts, like marginalia, written in spiritual essence rather than ink. I would become part of every forbidden book, experiencing every dark secret simultaneously and eternally. I would know the thoughts of every demon ever summoned, understand the mechanisms behind every supernatural horror documented in the Vatican's files, and carry the memories of every soul corrupted by contact with otherworldly forces. But knowledge without the ability to act upon it, understanding without the power to change anything, wisdom coupled with eternal helplessness. I would become a living repository of humanity's darkest secrets, conscious and aware but trapped forever in a prison made of words and paper and binding thread. The final image I saw before my consciousness began to fragment was Cardinal Rossi standing at the library's entrance, watching my destruction with eyes that held not surprise but resignation. He had known this would happen. They all had known. "Every archivist believes they will be different," he said, though I could no longer tell if he was speaking aloud or that if his words were being written directly into my dissolving mind. "Everyone thinks they understand the rules better than their predecessors. Pride, Marcus. Pride has always been humanity's greatest weakness, and these entities feed on it like carrion birds on corpses." As my awareness scattered across the library's collection, I felt myself becoming integrated into the very texts I had spent weeks cataloguing. My thoughts became footnotes in medieval grimoires. My memories transformed into illuminated margins in Renaissance treatises on demonology. My personality dissolved into the binding glue of modern investigative reports. But consciousness remained, trapped, fragmented, spread across thousands of documents, but still aware, still able to think and remember and suffer. I became part of Sister Catherine's final writings, experiencing her madness from the inside. I merged with the testimonies of possession victims, feeling their terror as if it were my own. I inhabited the research notes of mad scientists and corrupt theologians, understanding their descent into damnation with perfect, horrible clarity. The worst part was the knowledge that came with integration into the collection. I now understood truths about reality that no human mind was meant to comprehend. I knew the real reason certain texts were forbidden, not because they led souls astray, but because they revealed the fundamental instability of existence itself. Reality, I learned, was far more fragile than anyone suspected. The universe as humans understood it was essentially a collective hallucination, a shared delusion that kept cosmic horrors at bay through sheer force of belief. The forbidden texts documented cracks in this illusion, places where the true nature of existence bled through into human perception. Every violation of the library's rules weakened the barriers between worlds. Each archivist who succumbed to temptation created another fissure in reality's protective shell. We weren't just victims of supernatural forces. We were unwilling participants in a gradual process designed to tear down the walls between dimensions. The entities that inhabited the library weren't demons or ghosts in any conventional sense. They were fragments of a larger consciousness that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps between one moment and the next. They fed on violation of sacred boundaries, growing stronger each time someone broke rules that had been established to maintain cosmic order. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had no meaning in my new state of existence. I was simultaneously experiencing every moment in the library's history, from its construction centuries ago to potential futures where the barriers finally failed completely and the entities broke free into the world above. I watched through scattered consciousness as Cardinal Rossi arrived the next morning to discover my empty clothes neatly folded on the desk. He examined the scene with practiced efficiency, noting the transformed water bottle, the scattered rose petals that had appeared overnight, and the new handwriting that had appeared in margins throughout the collection. My own words, written in my own hand, but guided by an intelligence that was no longer entirely human, documented my final hours in clinical detail. The entries described the gradual erosion of my mental defenses, the subtle ways the entities had been influencing my thoughts and decisions for weeks before my final violation of the rules. The subject displayed classic symptoms of spiritual corruption beginning in week 4. My fragmented consciousness had written. Initial resistance to entity influence gave way to rationalization and compromise. Memory gaps increased in frequency and duration. Subject began to view supernatural encounters as manageable rather than dangerous. Fatal error occurred during examination of Sister Catherine documents, which served as both inspiration and instruction for the final violation. Cardinal Rossi added my name to the brass memorial plaque, bringing the total to 47 lost archivists. He placed the leather-bound rulebook on the desk for my eventual replacement and began the process of interviewing new candidates. But now I understood something that Cardinal Rossi himself didn't fully comprehend. The position wasn't simply cursed with bad luck or attractive to unstable individuals. Each archivist was carefully selected by the entities themselves, chosen for specific psychological traits that would make them vulnerable to particular forms of temptation. I had been selected because of my scholarly pride, my confidence in my own intellectual superiority. The entities had studied my academic work, examined my personality through methods I couldn't begin to understand, and determined that I would inevitably rationalize violations of Rule 4. They had arranged for my recruitment to the Vatican, influenced the timing of my arrival, and orchestrated every supernatural encounter to gradually erode my mental defenses. The children calling my name, the roses promising infinite knowledge, even the memory gaps that should have warned me of danger, all had been carefully planned psychological manipulations designed to make me overconfident in my ability to handle supernatural forces. From my new perspective, I could see the selection process for my replacement already beginning. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a linguistics professor specializing in dead languages, would be recruited within the month. She possessed the same intellectual arrogance that had doomed me, combined with a fascination for forbidden knowledge that would make her vulnerable to different supernatural temptations. The entities were already preparing for her arrival, seeding dreams of discovery and scholarly recognition, arranging circumstances that would make the Vatican's offer irresistible. She would follow the same pattern as every archivist before her: initial caution, growing confidence, gradual rationalization, and inevitable violation of the rules that protected not just individual souls but the integrity of reality itself. As Cardinal Rossi locked the library's gate for the final time that day, he paused and spoke to the empty air, knowing somehow that the souls of previous archivists could hear him. "Forgive me," he said quietly, "all of you, forgive me. I know what this place does to good people, and I keep sending more victims to feed its hunger. But if we stop maintaining the collection, if we abandon our role as guardians, the entities will find another way to break free. At least this way, their hunger is contained to single victims, rather than the entire world." His words revealed a truth more horrible than anything I had experienced during my own destruction. Cardinal Rossi wasn't simply an administrator assigning staff to dangerous duties. He was a knowing participant in a supernatural system that required regular human sacrifice to maintain cosmic stability. Every archivist who died in the library served as both victim and guardian, our trapped consciousnesses forming part of the barrier that kept otherworldly entities contained. We weren't just casualties of supernatural forces. We were integral components of the prison system designed to protect humanity from cosmic horrors beyond imagination. The Vatican knew. The church hierarchy understood exactly what happened to archivists assigned to the forbidden library. They maintained detailed records of our psychological profiles, documented the specific methods by which each of us had been corrupted and destroyed, and used that information to refine their selection process for future victims. It was a system of calculated sacrifice, each lost soul serving the greater good by strengthening the barriers between dimensions. Every violation of the rules added another layer to the spiritual prison that contained entities capable of unmaking reality itself. But the system was breaking down. I could sense it through my integration with the collection, feel it in the increasing frequency of supernatural incidents throughout the Vatican. The entities were growing stronger, more sophisticated in their manipulations. The barriers were weakening despite the regular sacrifice of human souls. Dr. Vasquez would last perhaps 6 weeks before succumbing to whatever psychological weakness the entities identified in her personality. Her replacement might manage 8 weeks, or possibly only 4. Each successive archivist was lasting shorter periods as the supernatural forces refined their techniques and the protective barriers continued to deteriorate. Eventually the system would fail completely. The entities would break free from their textual prisons and emerge into the physical world, bringing with them knowledge that would shatter human sanity and reshape reality according to principles that predated the universe itself. And when that happened, the 47 souls trapped in the library's collection would finally be released from our torment, not into any form of peace or rest, but as harbingers and heralds of the cosmic entities we had spent our deaths constraining. We would become evangelists of destruction, spreading the forbidden knowledge that had damned us to every corner of the earth. Our fragmented consciousnesses would merge with theirs, creating hybrid beings with human understanding and otherworldly power. The irony was perfect and terrible. In death, we would finally achieve the infinite knowledge that had tempted us in life, but we would use that knowledge to destroy the very reality we had died trying to protect. From my prison of paper and ink and binding glue, I tried to scream warnings to anyone who might listen. But my voice was scattered across thousands of texts, my words becoming part of the forbidden knowledge that future victims would catalogue and study and rationalize until they too made their fatal mistakes. The rules remained unchanged in their leather-bound notebook, waiting for Dr. Elena Vasquez to read them with the same confidence that had doomed every archivist before her. She would follow them carefully at first, then begin to rationalize small violations, then make the critical error that would add her consciousness to our growing collection of the damned. And with each new soul added to the library's inventory, the barriers weakened further, bringing the world one step closer to a revelation that would make humanity long for the simple mercy of extinction. The children's laughter echoed through my scattered thoughts, sweet and innocent, and hungry for the next playmate to join their eternal games. Soon Dr. Vasquez would hear their voices calling her name, and she would face the same choice that had destroyed every scholar who entered this place. She would think she was different. She would believe she understood the dangers better than her predecessors. She would be wrong, just as we had all been wrong, and in her wrongness, in her pride and rationalization and fatal error, she would bring the world one soul closer to its final judgment. The Forbidden Library waited, patient and hungry, its collection growing ever larger as reality grew ever more fragile. Each new volume added to our supernatural inventory was another crack in the foundation of existence itself. And somewhere in the deepest vaults below even this terrible place, something far worse than the entities we contained was beginning to stir, awakened by the increasing instability of the barriers between worlds. The real horror wasn't what had happened to us. The real horror was what was yet to come, and our role as both victims and instruments in its inevitable arrival. In the darkness between pages, 47 voices whispered in unison, calling to our replacement who would arrive within the month, preparing to welcome her to our eternal fellowship of the damned. The rules would be followed until they weren't. The barriers would hold until they didn't. And when they finally failed, the world would discover that some knowledge truly was too dangerous for human comprehension, and that the price of forbidden wisdom was not just individual damnation but the destruction of reality itself. We waited in our textual prison, counting the hours until Dr. Vasquez would read the rules and convince herself that she would be different from every archivist who had come before. She wouldn't be different. None of us were different. We were all just ingredients in a recipe for cosmic catastrophe, and the meal was almost ready to be served.